Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Vice-Chancellor, to Professor Gadd, Professor Pennington. My topic this morning is not the one that's publicised. It's why do children and young people not attend schools? And a lot of this will be tied in with my interests in the impact of poverty on education. Now, this is where I come from. As you can see, the one in the top right is what I'd normally be doing on a Saturday afternoon. And at the bottom, you'll see the well-known Australian actor Mel Gibson acting as William Wallace, which was filmed in Ireland. So it's a bit Scottish, as most of the people in the room are. And this is what our university looks like. These are the old buildings built in the 19th century, but the university goes back to the 16th century and is very old. Quite an ambitious keynote this morning. I want to do quite a lot. I want to talk, first of all, about human rights and school education. I then want to talk about poverty, child poverty and school education. I want to pick out some key issues about child soldiers, child labour and child slavery, human trafficking and forcible displacement, because all of these imply that children are not in school. And then I want to talk about a case study of some of our research in Scotland. So it's very ambitious, but I really want to finish up talking about the Scottish case study because it demonstrates an example of where a school has been able to include and ensure that the most vulnerable children remain in school. Oops, sorry. I won't spend too long on this. The human rights legislation is quite clear since 1948. Before I even go through this, of course, the human rights legislation has been contested as being too Eurocentric, as being too Western, and indeed is contested within the Western world. So for instance, at the moment in England, not Scotland, they're thinking about trying to pull themselves out of the arrangement with the human rights legislation and create their own human rights legislation. Now, many of us in Scotland would be very anxious about that because then you reconfigure your own version of human rights. But the human rights legislation since 1948 has been very clear. One of the aims has been, if I'm speaking too quickly, stop me please, I'm conscious of my accent, that education should be compulsory and free for all, especially at the primary level. And this has been reiterated through a series of meetings and documents since 1948. So we can see through the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the World Declaration on Education for All, the Dakar Framework, and we come up much more contemporaneously to the Millennium Development Goals, which again, the aim is always universal primary education for all and secondary education where possible and where the local resources will allow. And takes us way up to date, of course, with the Sustainable Development Goals, which once again reiterate this aim. Now, it's very easy, and in conversations we have in the UK and in parts of Europe, it's very easy to be cynical about the human rights legislation. However, these aims, aspirations are praiseworthy, and of course there have been some successes. We have not achieved universal primary education for all, but the aim, the aspiration is there, and people still try hard to reach this aim. I've been very taken by what's called the 4 essential features of the right to education. And this came out a couple of years ago from a special rapporteur from the UN. And I find this quite useful. It's limited. Again, it can be contested. However, it is useful. And just so we're very clear, I would apply these 4 essential features to the UK and Scotland. This is not about me talking about things happening in the so-called developing countries, because as it will become clear by the end of this lecture, the UK, Scotland faces very serious challenges about the inclusion of children and young people in school, quite frightening challenges. So the 4 A's, I think, are very useful. Number one is about education is free and government funded. There's an adequate infrastructure, and teachers are trained adequately and properly and professionally. Now, I'm going to use an example from Scotland. Just the other day, there was a major investigation in the Scottish Parliament, and one of our trainee teachers from somewhere called the University of Edinburgh, not Glasgow, was saying that she had not been prepared adequately to teach numeracy in schools. Immediately, there's a big question mark about one of the forays as maybe not being met in Scotland. The second one is accessibility, and is the school free for safe access? Is it accessible to all? And free for safe access is a really good point, because if children are living in a war zone, then they're not able to go to school. There's no discrimination on grounds of race, colour, ethnicity, gender, language, religion, disability, economic or social status. Again, I'm going to apply this to Scotland, to where I live. We have to think very carefully about social status. The way our school system is constructed is a local school where everybody will attend. However, if you live in a better area, your school is a slightly better school. So you buy into the area, you buy into the school. So it's a kind of discrimination. The third one is acceptability. Is the education of a sufficient quality? Is it relevant? There's no discrimination on specific cultural approaches. Is it good quality in terms of content and resources? And the last one is adaptable. Can your education system adapt and evolve with the changing needs of children? Now, this is very important. And again, I keep coming back to my country, because can we adapt our system to engage with the significant number of Roma children who've arrived in the city of Glasgow? Can we adapt to the number of Polish children who've arrived in some of the old industrial towns? Can we adapt to the continuing number of Asian children who come into our country who may have challenges of language, culture, and maybe sometimes religion? So can your system adapt and integrate these children? Now, I wasn't going to talk about this, but we did a piece of research a couple of years ago about the way in which the school had integrated a significant number of Polish children into what was basically a Scottish school. This posed huge challenges, and the head teacher, who's a very, very inspirational person, said, okay, the only way this is going to work is if the whole school changes. We all change. We can't just have classes in Polish and mark Polish celebrations. The whole school has to change. We all have to think in terms of a new community. Poverty is something that I started thinking about in my own country, and that's why I'm thinking more globally now, because it's such a problem. It's usually associated with the material need, and it depends where you are. Lack of food, fuel, healthcare, adequate clothing, housing, and of course a lack of resource, usually financial. Things like fuel. We now have a major problem with what's called fuel poverty. If you live in rural parts of Scotland, then it's very expensive for you to fill your car with petrol. We talk about absolute poverty and relative poverty. Sometimes we talk about severe poverty. Absolute poverty would be poverty where at least one of these items would be lacking in the family, or maybe more. Relative poverty is more about poverty relative to the situation you're in. Now again, I'm going to talk about the UK. It would be easy to think that people in the UK were living in relative poverty. A significant number are living in absolute poverty. In other words, they're missing one of the essentials in life. And we can talk about developed and developing countries, and I think sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it's not. And one thing that we've done a lot of work on, threshold measurements. Where do you draw the line? I'm going to move away from the screen for a minute. Where do you draw the line? Who creates the line? Below the line you're poor, above the line you're not poor. The difficulty with threshold measurement is somebody else has created it. I'm going to show you in a minute what that can imply. And often where we are, poverty is related to unemployment, but actually there's an increase in what's called working poverty, people who are working and still living in poverty. Now, how does this affect children? Well, taking that second point, The problem is that children are dependents. Children are poor because the family is poor. Children are very vulnerable in this situation. And poverty is intrinsically linked to, and probably mostly experienced by the mothers. Poverty is actually a gendered issue as well, which many people don't seem to notice. It's often the mother of the family who has to cope and negotiate and engage with the implications of having a lack of resource in the household. Children, of course, and this is quite important, defined as less than 18 years old unless legally specified. I'll come back to that. There are roughly 2.2 billion children in the world, and about half of this figure live in poverty. A sobering point, 1 in 4 children in developed countries live in poverty, and actual fact, Scotland, we're above that. Our figures are slightly above that. In Glasgow, where we have our university, one of the oldest universities in the world, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, of course, our figure is moving towards 1/3 of children living in poverty. Post-industrial city, facing huge problems economically, so you're talking about 1/3 of the children living in poverty. Let me talk about the threshold again, because we've spent a lot of time thinking about this and working on this. There's an academic called Adamson from Wales who talks about a 3-dimensional approach when talking about child poverty, the way we measure child poverty. The number of children who fall below a national poverty line, in other words, what's the number? How far they fall below the line, and that's a very good point, because the threshold is just a line. Below the line, you're poor, but you could be further down, even further down. So it's an artificial measurement. How long do you remain below the line? So in other words, it could be, we've got something in the UK now called a low pay, no pay cycle, where parents are in low pay or no pay, where they're just about breaking even. So how far do the children stay? But is it months? Is it years? We, in fact, would argue that there's a 4th dimension that Adamson's missed. Because this in much of the research we've done in schools, this is something that we begin to pick up on. In other words, how far above the line, the line that's been set, no matter how you set it, whether it be a government line for benefits, whether it be the free school meal entitlement, which is one that's used frequently, whatever line you use, it's a line. How far above the line are you, and you're still in poverty? Because the line says, below this, you deserve certain things, you're entitled to certain things. Above this, you don't need it. You don't need support. You don't need the help. You don't need extra resource from the government. And how far above this would you be, and you would still be poor? So it creates a huge problem. You know, a 1/3 of the children in Scotland, in Glasgow, sorry, are poor and deprived. It's probably even more. Let's move on to some of these quite important themes that I've picked up on before I go back to Scotland, and I'll watch my time. Child soldiers, to me, I've picked some of these topics because they're kind of hidden topics. The one I'm not going to talk about is disability, children with disability. I don't need to, because we've got the expert here, Professor Gadd. But these are kind of hidden topics. These are topics we don't often think about. Each one of them, there's an implication. The children aren't going to school. It's not a question of violation of their human rights. They're not going to school. They're not learning. They're not engaging with other children and growing up in a way that's going to help them develop into adults who will contribute to society. Interesting that there's not a great deal in the history about child soldiers. It starts to come in during the Second World War. It starts to come in with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, 1970s. But it is prohibited in 1977 and by the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And really the recommendation is that no child, remember, 18, no child should be engaged in an army or armed conflict. 18. That's the recommendation. Many countries have agreed to this. Oh, except the UK. You can still be recruited at 16. I've pointed this out several times. Didn't go down very well. 16. We still recruit young men and women now at 16 for armed conflict, which is against the recommendations Got the wrong one. And the Paris Principles talks about protecting children from being unlawfully recruited, and that's been endorsed by 100 states. Now, these are the figures for children involved in armed conflicts, not the children who are actually in armies. There's probably another 500,000, million or so who are actually in an army, not engaged in armed conflict. Boys and girls, they're used for various purposes, and increasingly they're actually being used for armed conflict because the availability of lighter weapons has made it much easier for them to be used. I suppose the point is, if they're engaged in armed conflict, they're not in school. There's another point here, a much more serious point, is when children are released by armies around the world, when they are able to escape, there are huge problems with their reintegration back into families, back into communities, and back into school. Because of the experiences these children, young people have had, makes it very difficult for them to go back into what we would call a kind of normal life and the rhythm of a normal life. Child labour, we need to be very careful with this because many families throughout the world need children to assist with the family business or the farm, or indeed anything that the family needs to do to create resource. When we were young, my father ran a small business, and we would all help at various times in the year, quite happily, because it helped to create resource for the family. So we need to be careful. The difficulty is when child labour interferes with the schooling of the child. That's the problem, when it interferes in any way with the opportunities for young people. And here, the International Labour Organization says it deprives children of their childhood, potential and dignity, and is harmful to their physical and mental development. With something like 168 million throughout the world, but this figure has gone down. Actually, they're making great inroads here in Asia, Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa. This is a very interesting slide. On the left, you've got Ghana, this is the cocoa trade, and you've got a significant number of children involved in that, something in the region of 300,000 children. On the right, you have tobacco. Now, these are the two big kind of areas where people are very concerned about children being involved in the labour because they seem to spend most of their time. On the right, we've got tobacco industry, and children are used and work long hours in places like Malawi, Argentina, Brazil, and China, and United States of America. In some parts of America, in some states, there is no law about how many hours a child can work outside of school. Now that means they could be working long hours outside of school. Now that, while they're not missing school, this will interfere with their ability to engage with school in a meaningful way. So although the child might not be missing school, even though they're engaged in child labour, it becomes very difficult for them. And child slavery is where all rights are taken away from the child, and where the child is basically either abducted or sold and works in slavery. Now, I use these slides quite often, and sometimes I talk about trafficking of adults. And it's quite funny because I use all these slides, and I use a slide of some Chinese people working in a Chinese restaurant, and each time I'll say, where do you think this is? Where do you think this is? And the Chinese one will say, oh, China. I said, no. Or some part of India. I said, no. It's in the town I live in, where I live, a small, quiet, sleepy suburb outside Glasgow, where they discovered the local Chinese restaurant and more or less trafficked people to work. So it's not something that belongs to other parts of the world. It's actually in the UK on your doorstep. And probably the more extreme version of this, of course, is human trafficking, and there's a significant number of people trafficked throughout the world. 3,800 children trafficked in the UK in the last year. Some from without the UK, some within the UK. I'm not going to talk about the rest of the world, I'm going to talk about the UK. So 3,800 people, and that's not talking about the unaccompanied children. Unaccompanied children are children who have no parents with them. And the figures there are something like 1,000, 1,500 in the UK. In other words, children nobody can account for. And the final kind of theme I want to talk about is forcible displacement. I'm going to use Syria. I'm going to use Syria because I like the Syrian example because we see a great tragedy here for families and for children. We also see people attempting to do something about it. attempting to negotiate the challenges. And we've got a couple of problems here. We've got the health service it's kind of collapsed in many ways because of the war. We've also got so many people internally displaced. It's not a question of the refugees being in Turkey and Lebanon. It's a question of being internally displaced within your own country. In other words, it's not your home. And we've got issues with schooling. Is the schooling safe? Is it safe to go to school? What kind of quality is the schooling? How accessible is the schooling? And this is one of my favorite photographs. This is in Aleppo, in Turkey. And it's a school. It's a lovely school. It's a lovely photograph. However, they live in the school as well because they're actually internally displaced. They don't actually belong there. So the school doubles as a place to live and doubles as a kind of safe place for them. And this is one of the tent schools. It's very limited what they can do. They can only have schooling for a certain period of time. It's only in English and maths and maybe a bit of the language. That's all they can do. The teacher has got to rotate around different classes. We have a student from Iran, PhD student, who has worked on what is the quality of the education in the tent schools. And he went over to some of the tent schools. He had to go over first because it wasn't safe for him to go later. And what he discovered was really interesting. People are doing really well. They're trying very hard, but they're battling the kind of depression in the whole tent city because people are anxious to get home. People are becoming uncertain about their future. And yet they've managed to create some form of schooling for the children and young people. Let me go back to, I want to now finish off by looking, and maybe we'll have time for a few questions, maybe we won't, to Scotland and this particular small piece of research. Now we've done some big research on the way in which children have got into positive school destinations. We've done some big research on the integration of Polish children. I want to talk about this. This is a small-scale project, small-scale research, but for me, it's probably some of the most powerful research we've done in the last 10 years because this school keeps those children who would normally just disappear in school. Remember, 1 in 4 children are living in poverty in the world's richest countries. The UK is 27, Scotland's 26. As I said, Glasgow is a third. Children are dependent. They're linked to the poverty of the families. Poverty, now this is hotly disputed. This has become a major debating point. Is poverty intergenerational? In other words, does it come through the family, through the children, through the next generation? The answer is yes, it does. We can argue all we like. The answer is yes. So we're into third generation poverty. And do families become stereotyped and stigmatized as the poor and the other? And the answer is yes, they do. Yes, they do. There's a big, and of course the children can feel this very keenly. What happens to the children who are coming from homes of poverty and deprivation? What we discovered is it affects their performance in school, it affects their attainment, they're less ready for school, their conduct's probably going to be more unpredictable, they're more likely to be excluded from school. So the child who's coming from a home that's poor, probably disrupted, there's probably not enough to eat, comes to school, ill-prepared for school. There's often an absence of an early learning environment. In other words, there's no books in the house. There's no computer in the house. The assumption is now that everybody would have access to the internet and a computer. Wrong. Wrong. Lots of people don't have access to a computer and internet still in this day and age. So they're more likely to be excluded because their behavior is a symptom of their inability to cope with what's going on in school. The government have tried various interventions, targeted interventions. They're talking now about the attainment challenge. And again, we're actually just about to begin work with the attainment challenge, doing the research on this. They've given money to schools to support initiatives to help the most disadvantaged children. What have we discovered? Our literacy is falling, our numeracy is falling, and our science is falling. How are we going to improve these? And how are we going to enable the most disadvantaged children to improve here as well? Okay, and this will be me. I'm going as quickly as I can. Actually, this will be me finished. This is called a nurture group. Now, a nurture group is nothing new. It's quite well known in England, certainly. Scotland, not so well known. And it's set up as a small unit within a school. You need a room, a separate room, and you take every indication that it's a classroom out of the room. You have soft furnishing, you have a small table, like a dining table, you have a TV. You make it like a kind of studio flat. You make it as comfortable as you can, and the idea is that the most vulnerable children can come here in the morning for an hour, and they can come at any time during the day for support and guidance. Now, these are children who would normally fall out of school. These are children who are coming from homes where they have been physically, sexually, psychologically abused. They're coming from homes where the parents are addicted to drugs or alcohol. They're coming from homes where it's a single parent family and the mother has died and they're in care. These are children who struggle emotionally to cope with what we would call the normal school day. Now, the aims are, the classroom offers a safe base. It's about nurturing. It's about supporting people. Language is vital, behaviour is communication, and it's about helping them through the school year. Now, this is the school. We did the research. This is them receiving the award for being one of the best in the UK. We were all invited. A very lovely day. However, a day that came at a price, because one of the biggest problems they had was to allocate this amount of resource to a room and to 2 designated teachers means you take the allocation of resource from somewhere else. And this, of course, caused trouble in the school. Huge trouble. Our research dimension was quite limited, but really quite illuminating. We spoke to 15 pupils. This took a long time. This was not like a normal set of interviews. These were very, very challenging children and young people to talk to. They were the most vulnerable people I've ever met. I found this, I've interviewed hundreds of people. I find this very difficult. My colleague, who's a research officer, found this even more difficult. Very difficult to talk to the children. Once you gain their trust, though, very interesting what they had to say. And we sat them in groups. They were allowed to leave the interview at any point they wanted, because some of them just couldn't cope with speaking to a stranger, even after several meetings. Just going to go through 3 themes, and then... So, they talked about having a safe space. The children said, this is a place where you can talk about feelings. This is a place where, if you're finding emotionally school to be very challenging, you can talk about your feelings. You can talk about what's bothering you. You learn how to treat friends properly. In other words, many of the things that we'd expect children to learn through interaction with other children, you have to teach these children. You can have a break when you're having a bad day. A bad day for them would mean running out of school, causing havoc and running out of school, leaving school, and therefore excluding themselves. It's about quality of relationships. The teachers are not in this relationship of the pedagogue or the learner or the instructor. The teacher is there not quite as a counsellor, but somebody who is helping them to work their way through the school day. Someone you can trust, people you can speak to, people who have got time for you. And finally, it gives you positive outcomes. It helps them to prepare. When they feel comfortable, they can go to the class they're supposed to go to. Now, I know that sounds really odd, you know, and we spent a lot of time in the school, but otherwise those children are walking out the door. They're not included. They're not, in other words, the whole point of the lecture, they're not at school. They're not in school. But with this method, they managed to keep 99% of the children in school. And this is a school that has got a large area of deprivation. They keep the children there. So it makes us feel better about ourselves. In other words, self-worth, self-esteem are huge issues for these children. And tellingly, helps you get over losses in the family. Nearly all of them have some form of bereavement to cope with. We are very impressed by it. We've done a lot of research, but this is the one that's stuck with us, that's kind of captured our imagination, because this is the one that genuinely has managed to keep the most vulnerable young people in school but at a price. It has been expensive. It has been about resource. It has been about hard decisions. It's been about other things not being done. The school has gone from strength to strength. They have established themselves as a hub. They've become a national beacon. They're being visited every week by somebody from a different part of the world. They're all over the newspapers. And we're going to use them as part of our educational conference in November. And let me just finish then, because I'm conscious that many of you are doing education, because one of the things we've also realized over the last 10 years, when we're looking at the impact of poverty on education, when we're looking at why children do not attend school, we did not intend at any point to look at leadership. Not really, but we keep coming back to it. Time and time again. It's about the leadership in education. It's about leadership in schools. It's about the commitment of the leader to having what we've called a vision of a socially just approach. Does the leader in the school understand the challenges that are in this school? Not something out of a book, not something out of theory. Do they understand the challenges in this particular school? And how are they going to cope with it? We've also come across this many times, that the socially just school leader will have what we've called a vision of expectation and inclusivity. In other words, everybody is expected to succeed in school in some way. And secondly, everybody is included. Because what we've discovered, and we've got to be careful about this, we've discovered schools where they will take those children who are going for national exams, national certificates, and to be honest, they're quite happy to sacrifice some of the others. We found schools that will do that, or take other children going to further education, and are happy to let the others just drift away. These are people who insist that everybody in the school must succeed in their own way and move on to the next stage in life that is appropriate for them. And I could go on about that as well. And it's about risk-taking. It's about distributed leadership. Every time we've looked at this across 3, 4, 5 projects, it's always the same. You've got this leader with however, where the leader is the only one who has this vision, it falls apart. Where the leader distributes the leadership among the staff, it suddenly starts to work and works continuously. Because the danger is, if it's all about the leader, when the leader moves school, the project falls apart. Because there's no one there to sustain it, because it's not been shared. When it's distributed, the leader could leave, but the staff are in place to continue the implementation of whatever strategy they've got. And it's about careful allocation of resources. Okay, it's quite a lot in about half an hour, a wee bit more than half an hour. Just try to talk about why do children not attend school. Try to talk about on the world stage, try to talk about different things, some hidden things, but also try to talk about, it's happening everywhere. The human rights legislation has the aim, the aspiration, but in lots of parts of the world, including the UK, children are not attending school. They're being excluded from school, or they're self-excluding. And at the very end, try to give one example of a school who've worked very, very hard to ensure that all the children are included. Now, the good news, and this is one of the reasons why we love this, is that other schools are beginning to follow this example, and the government is beginning to follow this example as well. Because we must make sure that all the children are included. And finally, because I'm here, the adverts. The Scottish Educational Research, if you all take a wee note of this, please. The Scottish Educational Research Association is an international association. We would love to see some of you there. The conference is in November, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, always the third week. Always nice and cold, you'll love it. One of the universities in Scotland, we welcome papers from staff, from PhD students, be delighted. We also have Facebook pages. Please feel free to join us. Please feel free to contact us. We would love to see some people from BUID there this year and certainly next year. Thank you very much. What I'd like you to do, gosh, it's getting warm in here, isn't it? Oh, I thought we had air conditioning, right? This is my summer. Just turn to the person next to you for a minute. What's your reaction to this? What's your reaction to all these things? You know, what have I said or what have I pointed out that has struck a chord with you, it resonates with you? Just a minute, just the person next to you, okay? What's the thing you'll take away?
Well, to have such a high percent of students are going to school is surprising. 27% of people in That's extremely high.
Yeah. It's okay. It's time to be controversial, folks. Okay. The government in Scotland, the government in England talk about their priorities. They talk about all kinds of things: immigration. They talk about economy. They talk about trade. The real underlying issue, the burning issue in Scotland and England, is poverty. Poverty has been for quite a long time. The poverty of the people, the poverty of the children. In Scotland, we now have, in 2016, a child poverty action plan. I'm going to be highly critical. The SNP government had allowed child poverty to go off the agenda over 10 years, till it disappeared. Now it's back, because poverty is the big issue. And it affects everything. It affects the quality of life. It affects expectations. It affects school education. And that's why the government now, and it's great, are now allocating a huge amount of resource to addressing the impact of poverty in schools. We're discovering that poverty means children aren't prepared for school. There's no learning in the house. The parents can't cope. They can't cope with the school day. How are they then going to go on to what the government calls a positive school leaver destination, which incidentally we call initial positive school leaver destination, because a lot of them don't actually finish that. How are they going to go into a job or training or college or university if they're ill prepared throughout school because of poverty? So, sorry, I'm talking.
Thank you. Mainly media sources report poverty levels in, however we want to define, developing or underdeveloped countries. And when you live in a country that doesn't necessarily fit that profile, it falls into that category of it's over there and therefore it's a problem, but it's not an immediate problem, however that becomes sort of reported. But just seeing the statistics of places where I've lived and I've grown up, and you think, well, how is the structure going to account for this? And so fine, you're talking about resources being allocated, and that's terrific, but that's now, and then it moves off the agenda in another 2 years' time, because particularly with the political framework that we're going through in the United Kingdom, it's not like it's a really big issue when we're worrying about the structure of the entire nation. But I don't know, it's, as a European, this is a very, very worrying reality, which obviously many of my colleagues face in their own countries day to day, but
You've come from Spain.
One of the places I come from, which is now the greatest unemployment in the world.
It's got the highest unemployment rate for people between 18 and 25. Portugal's the same, almost in the world. You know? So it's all... That's why I kind of reject the developing country thing, because it's easy to say, well, parts of India are very poor, parts of Africa are very poor. Actually, huge parts of the UK are really poor as well.
So one thing that just related to, and I'm sorry to take a microphone until somebody wrestles it off me. I was at a conference last month, and I've forgotten the lady's name, Baroness, something from within the UK government, was explaining about the level of life expectancy in Britain. And she said, if you take the tube, that's the metro in London, and you take it from Mile End, Lancaster Gate to Mile End, so something like 9 stops in London, the life expectancy drops by 20 years.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, she's kidding. Or she's mistaken.
No,
she quoted the statistic. I was like, that's impossible.
No, she's not.
And it's not impossible.
Where we live in lovely suburbia, life expectancy is about 80, 90. If you travel 5-6 miles, it's 70. No, it's to do with lots of things. But let's get back to the children, though. Let's get back to the impact this has on children. I'd like a student who feels brave. Brilliant, sir.
My name is Maqsood Cruz. I'm a doctoral student at Buet. My question is the following. Given the importance of the different aspects you mentioned regarding the children, their displacement, being slavery, etc. So in policy perspective, from an educational aspect, how can I push this agenda as a priority? So issues of poverty is obviously beyond the issue of the poor children themselves. issues of displacements, issues of slavery, issues of labor. This is beyond the issue of education, but still it's important that we still secure the right. How, in your opinion, we can push this agenda forward?
This is where you have to tackle these things on a number of fronts. It's about government, it's about recognizing the human right. Okay, we know human rights they're limited, we know that. However, they are there to support and protect people. It's a government supporting human rights, it's a government supporting poverty, it's a government admitting that these are issues, and it's not left to the non-government organizations, which it often is. It's about government talking about these being factors in the school education. You know, governments will talk forever about curriculum in schools. They'll talk forever about leadership in schools. They'll talk forever about, you know, the way in which schools are constructed. But these are other major issues because, back to my question, why do children not attend school? It's for these reasons. And yet, the children and young people are the future of the country. So it has to be a concerted approach. And this is where I think maybe people like ourselves in Glasgow and other people in other universities act as pressure points. Now, another quick advert. We have what's called a poverty and education network in the Scottish Educational Research Association. We brought together not just educationalists, we brought together sociologists who talk about poverty. We brought people from other parts of Scotland to act as almost a pressure point, to keep exposing the challenges and the impact of poverty in education. And one of the things that the teaching union has done is produce a document. I was going to mention this, and it's about how do teachers cope with the effects of poverty in children in the school day. In the 21st century, if they look hungry, if they look unkempt, how do we cope with this? Frightening stuff.
I'm Mohammad Asanullah. I'm a PhD student. My question related to children in school is that does it put the basic question of designing the school, whether it's private or the public sector schools, to make them inclusive? The very design of the schools, how they are operating, as you said, taking no differentiation between developing and developed countries, is something basic wrong with the design of the schools.
Do you mean the physical design or the design?
No, the both
structure.
system, both physical and also to make it inclusive, so that there isn't any line which defines the poverty in the education.
Yeah, I think I picked up your question. Yes, it's a huge, Is there something about the way we structure the school systems and school days that is excluding people? Yes, there can be. That's why I go back to the last slide. We need leaders to think about expectation and inclusivity. I think we're still working often on a model of attainment rather than achievement. Attainment and achievement means people who are able to engage with the examination system and do well. Achievement means the other children who are able to engage with other forms of education that will take them into different spheres of life. To get the balance is very difficult. To focus on one rather than the other creates a problem and creates a fault in the design of your school and your school structure because it automatically excludes one group of children.